Thank you. A few announcements. This evening, captions are available. You can hit the captions button at the bottom of your screen. We are live streaming onto Facebook, and we are also recording. So please turn your camera off if you do not want to be shown. Hello, I am Beth Myers, faculty member at Syracuse University and Assistant Director of the Center on Disability and Inclusion. On behalf of the School of Syracuse University School of Education, the Center on Disability and Inclusion, and the Tayshoff Center for Inclusive Higher Education, and Senator Rachel May's office, I welcome you to the Big Shift, Special Education and Mental Health in 2021. This evening came about through a conversation with Senator May's office a few weeks ago when we were wrestling with the effects of the pandemic for families, teachers, and individuals with disabilities as we thought about school and work. All of us and all of you have had to process what happened this year and to think about how we move forward. This is one step in that direction. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Joanna Masangila, Dean of the School of Education at Syracuse University.
Thank you, Beth. It's a pleasure to be together with all of you this evening. I would like to thank our co-hosts for tonight, Senator Rachel May's office, especially Nodija Hernandez and Senator May, as well as our community partners. Thank you to the Syracuse City School District, Sanchia A. Calendar Incorporated, and Juonio School. And finally, I'd like to thank the wonderful internal collaborators within the School of Education from the School Age Family and Community Engagement Center at Syracuse University, and the CDI directors and faculty members, Beth Myers and Christy Ashby from Teaching and Leadership, and Melissa Luke from Counseling and Human Services.
Thank you, Dean Masangila. Now I'm pleased to introduce the power behind this evening, Nodija Hernandez. Nodija is currently the Public Affairs Director for New York State Senator May. Previously, she wore many hats for 17 years with the Syracuse City School District, primarily working with students with disabilities, supporting behavior. She promised herself that when she left the district, she would never forget about the needs of our youth. Nodija recently received her master's in education and curriculum from the Syracuse University School of Education. Nodija.
Thank you, everybody. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to introduce Senator May, who I work for now. It's just a blessing to be in her office. So Senator May represents the 53rd Senate District, which includes most of Syracuse and outer towns of Onondaga County, all of Madison County, and part of Oneida County. She currently chairs both the Senate on Aging and Joint Legislative Commission on Rural Resources. She serves on other committees, including health. She is a huge proponent of public and higher education, a proud mother who graduated Nottingham High School in 2016. Her daughter also attended Juonio and Ed Smith. This taught Senator May a lot about inclusive education and mental health. Prior to serving as many of our senators right now, she was a director of sustainability education at Syracuse University, and we openly, heartedly welcome Senator Rachel May.
Thanks, Nodija. It has been such a pleasure getting to work with you and getting to know you throughout this process. Okay, now I get to introduce one more person, and I get to kick it over to my friend and colleague, our panel moderator for tonight, the director of the Center on Disability and Inclusion and fierce advocate, Dr. Christy Ashby.
Hello, everyone. Before I go any further, though, I would like to turn it back to Senator Rachel May, who's going to give us her welcome and introduction to this event as well. So thank you so much, Senator May, for being here.
Oh, thank you, Christy. And I'll be really brief, but you've all heard from Nidisia. She is amazing, and I am so lucky to have her as my Director of Public Affairs, but she definitely keeps our focus on what matters. And what we're talking about tonight is one of those things that matter so deeply when we think about the experience we've all been through this last year, but especially our children and children with disabilities, and just all of the stresses and strains that we're all facing, thinking about them multiplied multiple times when you've got a lot of other issues that you're dealing with. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists and from the conversation that I hope will develop as part of this evening, and I hope beyond too. So thank you again, Christy and Beth and Carly and Dean Masangila and the Center for Disability and Inclusion at SU, which does such fantastic work. And to all the panelists, I can't wait to hear your voices tonight. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Senator May. It is just such a joy to have all of you here tonight. This last year has been a time of tremendous change, disruption, and loss. Schools had to shift with almost no warning to virtual modalities of instruction. Families had to scramble to find ways to balance childcare with job responsibilities. Children were pulled away from their supportive routines, surroundings, and friends. This year has taken a toll, leaving no segment of this local community untouched and unchanged. And for students with disabilities, their families, educators, support people, there have been particular challenges. So before we launch into our panelists and our panel, and before we introduce our panelists, we want to start by hearing from one local middle schooler, Leo True-Frost, who's a middle schooler at Jamesville DeWitt School District, sharing his experiences with remote learning.
Thanks for talking to me today. I want to talk to you a little bit about remote learning. How have you enjoyed this year? Has it been good? Have you made progress, do you think, in your classes? Have you gotten good grades? Yeah, you have. Attaboy. Has it been hard in some ways too? What do you think's been hard about being at home for the school year?
Friends.
You miss seeing friends?
Leah, Kaylee, Tate, Miss Van Gabe.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of friends that you don't get to see because they're at school. Some of them are friends from before, and some of them are friends that you've made this year, but you've only been able to see them online, right? You're looking forward to seeing them in person when you go back to school? Yeah, that's gonna be great. Do you think you're gonna get to go back soon? Why?
Vaccine.
Yeah, you got your vaccine. You're getting your second one next week, right? What about your teachers? Do you miss seeing them? Which teachers do you miss?
Mrs. Burt.
Mrs. Burt, the Spanish teacher? You just started Spanish this year. Do you like learning Spanish? What could you do or hear differently if you were in the classroom instead of online for Spanish class?
Asking the teacher questions.
Is it harder to ask the questions when you're at home? Yeah, I can imagine. Have there been some times that you've become frustrated? Angry? What else? Give me some more feelings, ideas about feelings.
Angry, mad, sad.
Angry, mad, sad. Can you start a sentence with sometimes and tell me something that you do sometimes when you get angry or mad or frustrated during the school day when you're at home?
Sometimes I scream.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you from the other side of the house and the other from upstairs. I know you get really frustrated sometimes. Any things that would be a lot easier? What about science? What do you do in the science? What does the class do in science?
Labs.
Labs. What do they do during labs?
Seeing objects.
Seeing objects? You're unable to see the objects? Okay, yeah, that's good.
I think it's really important to keep individuals with disabilities centered in this conversation. And so before we heard from anyone else, we really wanted to hear from a young person. Obviously, Leo's experience is his own, but it reflects some of the challenges that lots of students with disabilities have experienced. But as we start to see a light at the end of this tunnel, you heard Leo mention vaccine, right? Many of us on this call, I'm guessing, are vaccinated and things are opening up. As we move into this next phase of the pandemic, we face yet another transition, a transition into whatever comes next. I'm not going to say a return to normalcy, whatever that means, but a shift to a new reality. In honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, tonight's panel will focus on this big shift. We have assembled an amazing group of local experts, parents, educators, community activists, and advocates to share a discussion on the challenges of this transitory time. But we'll also focus on strategies, resources, and new opportunities available in our Central New York community. And in addition to some resources that will get dropped into chat as we go, everyone that's registered for this event will get an email with an extensive list of local resources that have been provided and made available by our panelists. So I hope you'll find that useful. We are so thrilled you are here to enter into this conversation, and we encourage you to bring your questions, comments, and ideas forward when we get to the open discussion section of tonight's event, which will happen immediately following the panel discussion. But for now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. We are grateful for their time and their contributions to the discussion. Nadisha will introduce our first three panelists, and I will introduce our last three and then get us going. Nadisha.
So firstly, I am honored to introduce a man that I work the side of and I can call a friend. And he knows we've been in the district and we did some great things in the district together, advocating for our youth. Mark Warner is a teacher assistant in the Syracuse City School District. He started at Ed Smith and fell in love with the population, fell in love with those students, the communities, all of our students with all abilities. He currently works in the self-contained room at Syracuse School of Latin. Adrian Biarti is a consultant for remote learning at the School of Geronio. He has two children, one with a profound disability. Adrian taught in one of the younger rooms before spending this year working on different strategies for remote learning at Geronio. So Adrian was able to transition and help Geronio move from in-person learning to online. Monique Wright-Williams is the Chief of Staff for the Syracuse City School District, and we are honored to have her here with us. We are honored for her to be here and to engage in the conversation with us. Thank you to each of those three panelists.
Thanks, Nadisha. And our remaining three panelists, Samantha Pierce. Sam is the founder of Sanchia A Calendar Incorporated. She's autistic herself and is the mother of 5 children, some with autism. She says she can talk special ed and mental health all day long. So we'll be doing that for the next hour and 15 minutes here. Amy Zogby is here with us at SU as part of she's a professional development specialist for the school-aged Family and Community Engagement Center at Syracuse University, which is part of the CDI. She previously worked with the SU Parent Center, SUPAC. She's the mother of 2 children who have received services. And finally, last but not least, Melissa Luke is Associate Dean for Research and the Dean's Professor in Counseling and Human Services in the School of Ed. In addition, she's a practicing licensed mental health counselor. And prior to her current role at SU, she was a teacher in the Syracuse City School District. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. I hope you all can see the sort of depth of experience we've got. The first question I'm gonna pose, I'd like all of you to address. Give a brief, and I'm gonna hold you to brief, sort of comment on what you see as the biggest challenges for students with disabilities and their families as we move into this new phase of the pandemic. I'm actually gonna start first with Melissa.
I muted myself. Thanks, Christy. I'm happy to begin. I think that when we think about mental health needs and educational needs, very often we think about them as separate. And those of us who are family members and providers for students with disabilities, in particular, we understand the intersection of mental health and disability. That I start there because I think as we think about this transition, that for many of us, we see it as solely positive, that this idea of, even if we don't use the term, Christy, return to normal, but this opening up brings with it lots of hope, lots of possibility, as we saw from the student in the opening clip, access to friends and other folks that we love. But it does also bring, even though there's this positive, it brings some challenges with transition. So in particular, when we get used to a structure and system, and then we're moving to something that is unknown, it can raise anxiety. So for those of us who have struggled with anxiety to begin with, and that uncertainty, it really can feel out of balance. And as parents and providers, we don't always know with certainty what is coming. And I know that you wanted us to stay brief, but one of the unknowns relates to how we will continue or not to utilize remote services. So I am a big proponent to some of the positives that have taken place, and I know there's others on the panel that will speak to that. But for our children, our students, our providers, some of us don't know how much access we will have to some of the positive things that we've learned and been exposed to, and that's a challenge too.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for getting us started. It's a lot there already. I'm going to turn next to Adrian for your response to the question of what do you see as the biggest challenges right now?
I would say what I really saw during the course of the past year as a huge challenge for not just students with disabilities, but students in general, was the loss of a consistent daily routine that going to school provides. Being in a different location, it indicates that when you're at school, I'm here to learn. I know what the expectations are. And that's very different than when you're at home. So transitioning the school to a student's home is extremely difficult. And then it's really compounded by the fact that we're asking parents now to support our students as teachers do. And they're two very different skill sets. And to ask a parent to transition to that different method of support, it takes training and it takes practice. And having it thrust upon everyone so rapidly was extremely difficult for both parents and students.
Thanks, Adrian. Sam, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this as someone who's both navigated this in your role professionally, but also as a parent of young folks who are trying to navigate this right now. What do you see as the biggest challenge?
Well, a couple of the big challenges that I see have already been mentioned. One is that transition, the transition back to whatever it is we're going to be doing in the new school year. The other thing is the uncertainty of what students are going back to in the new school year. That does exacerbate existing anxiety about all of these different changes that are happening. Another challenge that I see is the fatigue that people are beginning to experience now, dealing with all of these unknowns and the changes and the loss. We're tired, and our students are tired. And we're not sure what exactly things are going to look like. And for some of us, we're dealing with the loss of people, the loss of friends, the loss of connection to friends, and then the physical loss of a person's presence in our lives because they lost their lives to COVID or other causes, and we weren't able to connect with them. So those are all things that are all mixed up in there that families and students are dealing with.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's so many kinds of loss that have happened this year. Mark, maybe you could add to this. I know in your perspective of being an in-school support, providing support to students, what are you seeing as the challenges, perhaps in your role at the Latin School?
I find that the shifting from the consistency and the shift in the paradigm actually coming back, because fortunately in my self-contained room, I've had my students back 4 days a week for a while now. But the biggest thing there was the shifting from just being home alone, where they could actually, if they wanted to tune us out, it's very difficult to tune your teacher or your classmates out when you're in class, because we could talk to them. But when they were remote, they wanted to tune us out. All they had to do was turn off the camera, turn off the microphone, and they're alone in their own little world. And also, with my students in particular, they were somewhat anxious on how they were going to be able to interact with their friends. I have a few of my students that are very concerned about COVID and the effects on them catching COVID. Some of them are old enough to get the vaccine, and also coming from households that may not want to get vaccinated. So that's a whole nother concern that they have to relate with. So I find the social anxiety, but slowly, my boys, we had a discussion today, and they're quite happy to be able to sit there, turn to their right, and have a discussion with their friends, even though it's behind a mask and a barrier and they're 3 feet apart, they're still able to turn to them. So I'm finding that that's the best. The socialization for my students is the most thing that's coming back, and seeing other adults and being able to interact with different adults besides just the adults that they have at home.
It's great as we look forward, those ideas of sort of reconnecting with people, but that does come with it a lot of anxiety.
Yes.
Amy, what are you seeing?
So for me, I think the biggest concern is around the breadth of experience that people have experienced over this past year and 2 months. So we know there have been a multitude of challenges, and some families were experienced a much different pandemic than others. So I think keeping that in mind as we shift back to in person, I think that is one of our biggest challenges, because some of our families have had compounding issues where they've had difficulty with food and housing, loss of family members, loss of jobs, and other families did not have that. So really considering that impact moving back is, I think, important and a difficult challenge.
Yeah, I think your comment on the sort of diversity of experiences. I mean, one of the things many of us noticed is that the pandemic didn't create inequity, but it unearthed and amplified inequities that already exist. And so, Monique, I'm going to turn to you as the last person to comment on this challenges. Obviously, in your role as Syracuse City School District, how do you see these challenges playing out?
Whoa, which challenge?
Yeah. What do you see as the biggest challenge right now in this time of transition?
Quite honestly, everything that everyone has said, I mean, it's really the bulk of what we're experiencing, or what families have been experiencing. I think one of the most difficult parts for families while we were not in school was the ability to access and utilize the services most appropriately. Like, there's some services that were not really replicable in the home. And so the loss of that, and the extended period of time that students did not have access to that, and having to go back in September, hopefully full-time, 5 days, and reacclimate yourself to, what you were doing and bringing yourself back up to speed and not being frustrated. But I really want to think about what the students said, because it doesn't matter what we think the students are struggling with. If they say the friends issue is the most pressing, then I think the loss of their friendships, and not due to COVID because they were deceased, but because they were separated and not able to interact with the people that they've come to have such good relationships with. So getting back to their social norms and getting back to full service usage.
Agree. I think you bringing it back around to Leo's comments are really important. And it actually leads me into my next question. Now, I had all of you answer that first question because I wanted all of us to get a chance to provide a frame. Going forward, I would encourage you, if you feel I've got something I can really say to this, to please indicate. The panelists are going to indicate by using the raise hand function. I noticed already I see Kate, thank you for putting a comment in chat. Please, as we go, feel free to drop your comments in chat. If you would like them to be questions for later, just please indicate that some way. You can say a question, but I want to turn to anyone in the panel can respond to this. Building off what Monique just said, how do we ensure as we look to the fall, when hopefully all students or most students will be back in person, how do we ensure that mental health and social needs are considered and supported as we attend to the academic needs, particularly for students with disabilities, but I would argue for all students? How do we rebuild those connections, that sense of safety, and do it in a way that keeps kids in community with each other? So how do we keep that focus? Because we know we've been paying attention to mental health differently this year, and that's actually been really positive. So how do we attend to those needs while we're thinking about attending to those academic needs and lost learning opportunities? Anyone want to take a stab at it? Absolutely. Amy, and then Mark. Thank you.
So I think this actually goes along with Monique's comment, which is really, we really need to assess need, right? We need to talk to our students, we need to talk to our families, and we need to see what their needs are. And I think that is the starting point in terms of really building solid support that they require. And again, making sure that we have voices from all of the families and all of the different communities in our school is of the utmost importance because of the different levels of experience that people had over this time.
Thanks. Yeah. So listening to families, asking what people need, I think that's really important. Mark, what do you want to add to that in terms of how do we keep the focus on mental health?
As an educator, I'm finding that I'm hearing a lot of people say, oh, our kids are falling behind, our kids are falling behind, our kids. What are they falling behind? It's not like one or two kids are falling behind everybody else. They're falling behind as an entire group, as an entire population. And what I hope to see is when we do come back in September, that we don't jump right on the hardcore academic trail, that we take time for social emotional stuff, take time for the bonding, take time for them to get just back in the swing of being social, of being there with other students, with other people, not so much forcing it down, oh, we got to get these numbers up, we've got to get the testing scores up. We've got to be more concerned with their social needs. And we do this by listening to the students and listening to the parents and trying to fulfill their needs.
Thanks. Yes, there has been so much talk about learning loss, and I think we need to recognize, of course, there's lost opportunities for learning, but we need to think about other kinds of losses that have happened and how do we support those. Melissa, what would you add to that? And then Sam.
Yeah, I think that we need to consider group counseling in addition to or in lieu of individual services. And so in particular, from a school setting, the coordination of group services is fraught with lots of complications. It's not just true locally, it's a larger phenomenon. But if we provide services and potentially even use remote access like we are right now, that addresses and infuses some of the academic learning along with the social, emotional, and mental health pieces as well. And I think that would do our youth quite well.
It's a great strategy and suggestion. Thank you. Sam, and then Monique.
I think one of the things that is also important is assessing the needs of the adults who are going to be in the classrooms with the students. The teachers, the aides, all of the support staff, even the folks that are working in the office that don't necessarily interact with families or students. We need to know how they're doing, and we need to also provide them with a social emotional support so they are not burnt out, so they have the capacity to be able to create those safe and nurturing learning environments that the students are going to need, especially after all what we have all been through together over the last year.
What a great point. Yes, it's not only youth that have students in school that have struggled this year. I mean, everyone has, but educators in general certainly have borne the brunt of a lot of that in schools, and we need to recognize there are needs there as well. And how do we support that? Thank you. Monique.
So I just want to add, is when you asked the question, how do we keep the focus on mental health? I thought we don't really have an option. If we don't focus on mental health, it means we're simply not paying attention, because the issues will present themselves quite clearly and early on. So I know from our perspective for the district, we've added quite a few social emotional learning supports for our students for when they come back. Many of our discussions are centering around, keep in mind, we're not coming back to September 2019 or 2018. We're coming back to September 2021, and it will not look like any other September. And so if we choose to not focus on them, they'll focus on us, and it will really eat into everything that we're trying to do academically with our students. So we don't really have an option. We're gonna have to do it.
Yeah, whenever I talk to folks, I always think about behavior in whatever form it comes out is communication, right? And if we don't have a way to communicate our isolation, communicate our anxiety, communicate our fear, our worry, it comes out. Not always in the ways that we wish it would. And so I think you're right. If we don't attend to it, we'll be forced to attend. And so there's some great comments going on in the chat about the importance of sort of reestablishing community and connectedness as really the focus of this re-entering, that we need to be centering that.
Chrissy, right? Chrissy, just to paint a picture for everyone, like we really have students that have been locked in their rooms for like the last year. Literally locked in their rooms. We've had a chance for all of our lovely introverts to just live their dreams. So it is going to be definitely a struggle. I just wanted to put that out there because Monica and Mark, you just hit on it just so well.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit, this idea that this wasn't this new move to remote learning actually really worked for some kids. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But I want to keep on this idea of supports and strategies a little bit. So Monique just mentioned that the district, SCSD, has put some additional socio-emotional learning supports in place. I'm actually going to come back to you briefly, Monique, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody else. Maybe you could talk about a couple of those specific things that are being put in place going forward. And then anyone else, what do we need, or what else do you know of that's been put in place?
So trying to still speak in turn because not everything in our budgets have been finalized at this point in time. But one of the things I can tell you we are committed to doing is putting a family advocate in every single building. Right now, I mean, a year and a half ago, we had 4 individuals for all 30 plus schools. And then we bumped it up a bit and we had around 10 to 15 people. Well, the commitment going forward is to have someone in every building who can interact with families, help identify what the family's needs might be, and then help find the resources so that they can attend to that. So that's just one of the things that the district will be doing. We have liaisons. We work with the county specifically for mental health support to make sure we have people in the school buildings. We have a rise in the buildings. So we're really just going to beef up some of our existing resources and then heap on as they come about. What I don't want you to think we're going to do is just devise all of our supports right now, and this is what we're going to do, because some of what we'll have to do is leave some room for the identification of what actually happens when we get there and what is the most pressing need and issue for our students. I mean, we're dealing with students right now that have, you know, suicidal ideation and things of that nature that we're not even back full time. We're just slowly easing into this. And so that much more focus we'll need to look at what resources we have in our buildings when we get back.
Thanks, Monique. And we all know how budgets work, right? I know we have Senator May on the call. We know that we have aspirational budgets and then we have real budgets. And so let's live in the aspirational right now for a moment though. So anyone else on the panel, what other resources and supports do you feel either that you know of that are moving into, that are being helpful, or what other sort of supports or strategies do you think would be essential for us to put in place to help kids as they transition and help families as they transition? Adrian.
Yes, I know, speaking, again, I do work with far younger children in general, but I think as educators, we all need to be given a chance to get to know our students again. Quite frequently, there's a continuity of care, really. There's a continuum. I take in kids in my school, they're toddlers, and I have them in this building for 3 years, and I get to know them, and I know their families, and I get to talk with other teachers after I hand them off and guide them, you know, to their next classroom. I'm available to answer questions about these kids because I know them. And really, we've lost an entire year or more in these kids' lives. And we don't know our students in the same way that I think we really need to, especially our students with special needs, to provide the highest quality of care. So as educators, we need to get to re-know our students.
Thank you. That's a really important point. Amy.
So I actually I shared an article with Carly, which I think is helpful in terms of just framing some simple ideas to consider when moving back into in-person. And it's preparing to return to in-person from COVID-19. So that's the title of the article. And it really has some good ideas in terms of taking the time for both families and teachers to reestablish routines, making sure that they're talking with students, either the classrooms or at home, about, you know, how they're feeling, things that are going on, how their friends are feeling, what they're experiencing, and making a plan with students to face their fears and think about different ways to reintroduce folks that are really struggling with anxiety about going back. So can you drive by the school regularly? Can you visit the playground? What are some things that you can do to slowly introduce students back that are really struggling? And then the other suggestions that the article had was helping kids learn how to do a helpful self-talk, which was really what would they say to a friend who's nervous? What can they say to themselves to help themselves feel brave? So just helping them build those skills. And then finally being a role model and what the article called was a courage coach, which I really enjoyed that term. And, you know, kids, and it's really just pointing out that kids are watching us, right? They're watching the adults in their lives and they are learning from us. So just keeping at the forefront of your mind when you're thinking, even though you may be very anxious yourself, to keep in mind that your kids are learning from you, and you have to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward to help them transition back as well.
So thank you. And so Carly just dropped in a link to that article. So again, you'll be getting an email with all of these, but there's a link to that specific article that has some very practical strategies. I think that idea of driving by the school or, you know, showing the pictures and names of the kids in the class, things that will help students sort of get acclimated. Sam, and then Mark.
I think especially for students who are receiving special education services, we need to really carefully assess what they weren't getting throughout the course of the pandemic when everyone went to remote learning, and think carefully about how we can provide those services. And for those students who, for whatever reason, are going to remain remote, make sure that there's a solid plan for how we're going to get them all of the services that they need. Parents really were drop kicked into this world where they, all of a sudden, they're home with their kids. They're the speech therapist, they're the special education teacher, they're the general education teacher. We were doing all of the things, and parents experienced a lot of frustration trying to connect with people who could support them in doing that. So moving forward, we have to think carefully about how we're going to provide support to families who are going to be doing all of those jobs for as they continue with remote learning, or as they just want to support their children's education when the kids come home.
Great, thanks. We're going to talk about some of those ways in just a moment. Mark, what would you add to this?
It's going to be important to be able to rebuild that trust for an open and honest and open communication with the parents and the students. To be able to honestly tell us how this past year has been working with your child at home and how they truly feel. And it's going to take a while, because I know for the past year, at least in my building, the parents weren't even allowed to come into the building. So it's going to be a whole new thing of building trust. And it would, we're going to have to, like I say, TRC, trust, respect, and communication. We have to learn to trust each other, respect each other's opinions, and be able to communicate those to each other and work as a team. And just as one big, as I love to use the word, family, and that's going to be really important. And I just want my parents and my students to know that they can be comfortable saying how they truly feel, whether it's brutally honest, whether they appreciate what we're doing or they feel we should be something different. If we don't have that true, honest communication, it's going to be very hard to do this.
Thanks, Mark. Melissa.
Yeah, as I was listening to these really informed panelists, a couple things came to mind for me, and one connects to this idea of that our students have really experienced a lot in our absence in a lot of ways, and when we think about the developmental periods that they are in across children and adolescents, what happens in 12 months to 18 months can be profound leaps in development. So what we knew of our students may or may not, completely map onto what they're coming back with. And connected to that, I think we're talking about the services that were potentially disrupted within a school environment, right? But very often we're talking about children and families who access services in the community as well. And so providers, in particular mental health providers, may have changed the type of services. And so as we're building these, reestablishing, I guess, this sense of community and connection, as folks are talking about, I'm thinking about how there may be entirely different providers that are involved that we have to access as well.
That's a great point, because, obviously schools exist inside communities, exist in systems. And so how do we think about all these moving parts? And for many families that we work with, they are engaged in multiple systems and social support systems, mental health systems, community centers. Like there's a lot of kinds of support and collaboration that has been disrupted. Several of you have talked about this idea of building communication and thinking about how we go forward. We had a great discussion amongst the panel last week in the planning about some of the things we have learned from the last year and a couple odd months, the affordances that remote has provided. So as we think about going into what's next, we need to recognize we don't necessarily want to leave all that in the rearview mirror. So I want us to think about, as we move forward, what new skills have we learned? How might we leverage some of these remote modalities to build that communication piece and that engagement piece that between families and schools or communities and neighborhoods? So So maybe anyone want to comment on sort of what can we take from this remote time that we're going to use to actually make our engagement with families and schools and neighbor and agencies better? Monique, you want to kick us off?
Sure, yes, we do family engagement all the time. And what we've discovered, and the truth is, we knew this pre-pandemic. Amy Zogby and I worked on a couple of projects pre-pandemic, and whenever we offered those sessions, we streamed them. And we'd have parents who did not show, more of them than those who were in the room with us. And so we've held what we call co-video chats ever since the pandemic started. We've had sessions with 200 some odd parents on the Zoom, and then another 200 on Facebook Live. And so we've learned that we really have to use multiple modalities in terms of connecting with our families, and getting people to come to school, I'm hoping, is less and less important for people as they talk about or look at a family who's truly engaged. That showing up to a PTO meeting in person, baking cookies or doing whatever, does not really define or identify what engagement looks like. And although offering meals always helped us, so people didn't have to worry about, oh, I can't do it because I got to go home and cook, and we would, make sure we could feed everybody. But I think people, even in those circumstances, prefer to just go home at the end of the workday, go home and still get the information. So being able to continue to use this forum, this kind of forum for our families, is definitely on our agenda.
So that's a great example of taking those co-video conversations that were designed because we didn't have any choice, right? That was out of necessity. If we wanted to connect, we had to do it remotely. But that created access for families that perhaps have not ever been in the building for a whole variety of reasons. And I think it's forcing us to think about, I really appreciate what you said about thinking about what an engaged parent or caregiver means differently, that it doesn't just mean working with the PTO, right? That there are lots of other ways to be engaged. Anyone else want to comment on maybe some technologies or supports that we're going to carry forward? I see Adrian leaning forward. I'm guessing he has something to say about this.
Yes, and again, this year, I think we've all learned wonderful new skills, and in this situation where it was just thrust upon us. And what I come back to frequently is, at Joanna every year, we have students who have long-term illnesses and miss substantial amounts of school. And in the past, we didn't really know how to do teletherapies. We weren't set up for it. We didn't have the tools to do it. We do now. And there's a comfort level with these new services. So to be able to not necessarily meet the student in their home, but still conduct a therapy session via Zoom, or live stream some of the classroom activities to keep that student engaged. And I know from my own experiences, when my son has not been able to go to school, but he can watch his friends over Zoom and they live stream their classroom morning meeting, he is engaged and he loves it. And he loves doing it from home, and he loves showing off his dog. So it's a way to interact with students outside of the classroom for a variety of reasons that may be going on. And I think there are also benefits to teachers where if we're doing IEP meetings over Zoom, and teachers, we service kids at Joanna from, I believe 15 different school districts at this point. If we don't need to have a teacher physically travel to go to an IEP meeting and miss half a day of school, then they're in the classroom for that time, which is a huge benefit. And it saves a lot of disruptions in the classroom environment.
Those are some great points. As a former special ed teacher that was often sitting on those CSE meetings, they were often not scheduled at times that were convenient for families who worked or had other childcare responsibilities. And often that would get read as, well, these parents aren't interested. I think we have to radically rethink that how can we utilize some of these modalities to create opportunities for participation that we didn't think existed before. Melissa and then Amy.
So sometimes counseling is referred to as talk therapy. I'm sure you've heard that in the public discourse, but all of us on this call who work with children and adolescents know that a lot of the expression and growth that happens is through expressive modalities. So play therapy, often with younger children, but other forms, we have art therapy, dance therapy, etc. And what, building off of what Adrian said, we have developed actually a research base that talks about how those methods can actually be effectively used through remote access. And it's a little counterintuitive, but it doesn't, just like a science educator might prepare a science lab and send it home and pick it up. It takes a lot of logistics, but so too can mobile play therapy sets to be used and the therapist can interact remotely. There's an entire program newly developed in the Visual and Performing Arts College here at Syracuse University in arts therapy, and it's solely online. So again, a little counterintuitive, but we know, we've actually known for 20 years, but now we know from necessity that we can do this work effectively. And I think it increases the access tremendously, in particular for families with children with disabilities.
Those are great concrete examples. Amy and then Sam.
So I know our time is kind of coming to a close here. So I do want to know that to let people know that there is an option for continued learning around this through the U.S. Department of Education. They are hosting a webinar tomorrow from 3 to 4 around returning to in-person, and specifically focusing around students with disabilities. And so I think that'll be a really great opportunity, and we will share that information as well. And then just some additional ideas in terms of continuing to offer the virtual meetings and events that folks had mentioned, but also, during this time, I feel like schools have had, by necessity, to increase their communication, whether weekly or monthly, and let, they're coming out as needed with information about if somebody was exposed. So I think kind of thinking about how can we continue that level of communication, and what can we do to continue communicating on a regular basis with families, and making sure that I think something as simple as making sure that school districts' websites are up to date and easy to navigate for families, I think is very helpful, especially now. But there are also some really great things that teachers did. They were reading to their students, recording themselves reading a book and sending it to their students. Myself, I had my son's occupational therapist or physical therapist record videos of things I can do with him at home. So their teachers were doing office hours to help kids at home with homework. So just some really great things, simple things that made such an impact during this time that we have to remember the impact that they had, and hopefully continue them.
Those are great examples. And yes, you'll notice lots of resources are getting dropped in. And don't worry, we still have time for open discussion, but Amy wanted to make sure she got those things out there. So Sam and then Adrian.
I wanted to piggyback on what Melissa said with utilizing those therapeutic methods that don't depend on speaking. There's a nonverbal population that has been left out of receiving important mental health services because they can't do talk therapy. So thank you, Melissa, for bringing that up and pointing out that there are lots of different ways that don't rely on verbal communication that we can assess and provide mental health care to students. And also, someone else mentioned in the chat about teachers being frontline workers. yes, teachers are frontline workers. They are often in a position to first notice when a student is struggling with their mental health. So it's important to have teachers also be fluent in those nonverbal ways of assessing a student and providing them with not in the mental health care, but with that relationship, that connection that can help support whatever's going on when a student's receiving mental health care.
Those are great points. Adrian, last thought on this question.
You know, I just wanted to add in, as we're talking about the remote piece and the use of technology, not all the technologies are created equal, and not all are good for different situations. And one thing we found is that conducting a physical therapy session online via Zoom is a very different thing than conducting a speech therapy session or conducting individualized instruction. So taking a look at what the students' needs actually are, what services are we trying to deliver, and using that as the starting point for deciding what technologies we provide with them or recommend that they seek out, and looking at it saying there's no reason why a physical therapy session can't be successful over Zoom. These are the steps we need to take to maximize that success. And how do we set up the space and the environment? What technologies are we providing? What is the field of view of the cameras? Those little things. Again, it's not just as simple as every student needs a Chromebook. They're wonderful in some cases, but really, especially our special needs kids, they need technological solutions that are tailored to their actual needs.
Those are really important points, and they actually touch on a couple of things I wanted to just mention from the chat. And one of them is there've been several people making comments in about one of the affordances that has come out of this time is that a lot of the accommodations and resources and supports that people with disabilities, including adults with disabilities, have been screaming for their entire lives, suddenly were now available. Right? It seemed impossible to have closed captioning running on the bottom of a meeting, right? It seemed there was no way you could provide a video that would show you how to do something so you could come back and refer to it later, that you could have chat so people who aren't comfortable or who aren't able to speak verbally, that's not their modality, could still enter into the conversation. So I think it's really important to recognize we have needed these things in our lives. Lots of people have. Now we know that it can be done when it had to be. So how do we make sure that that attention on individual specific accommodation and needs doesn't get lost? That's one thing I wanted to highlight that's come through in the chat. The other is one of my concerns as someone whose work is really focused on inclusive education. How do we make sure that remote learning doesn't become the default for kids we see as difficult to include? So how do we make sure that as we move into this next phase of this pandemic, that we move forward with a lens of equity and inclusion, not just access to content, right? So thinking about how do we make sure that we're keeping that at the forefront. Amy, you had a comment about that?
So yeah, I was actually just looking at the chat box and seeing that Senator May is introducing a bill to prevent instruction from being used as a punishment. And I feel like that is so very important. But I do also think in terms of the considering the least restrictive environment, that remote learning could be considered a student learning in the home environment. So that there are some natural protections in regulation, if that is in case, is actually how it's defined. But we would need some clarification around the regulations in terms of how to define remote learning and where on the continuum of services that gets placed. So that I think that is the good thing, is that there already is some information and protection specifically for students with disabilities, but it definitely needs to be woven in because it is happening for sure.
Yes, and we have seen that as some students return to 2 or to maybe 4 days of in-person learning because they were a student with a disability, oftentimes half of those days were just in the company of other adults. They weren't actually in classrooms. And while that was creating access for students to instruction that was necessary, we have to make sure that we're not creating separate systems within systems as we move forward. I really, this is really rich discussion. I do want to open it up to our all of our members of our community that are here. But before we do that, I was wondering, Senator May, if maybe you wanted to comment on any of what you've just heard as we move forward into this open discussion now.
Oh, absolutely. This is a wonderful conversation. And I am not obviously a practitioner the way you are, but I am a shy introvert who has been really exploring what are the benefits as well as the drawbacks of the remote world. And I am really eager to see how we can build on all the lessons that have been learned over the last year, positive and negative, in that space. Amy mentioned the bill that I put in the chat, but we did introduce a bill last week because we're hearing about this happening around the country, that schools are using remote learning and distance learning as a way to discipline kids or separate them from the rest of the class. And we don't want to see that. I made sure that the bill did include, if it was about public health, you know, for some reason a kid absolutely refusing to do what was safe for everyone in the room or something like that, that there were certain circumstances where it could be used, but that it shouldn't be used as a form of punishment. So that feels really important. I want to mention 2 other things. I'm sure you're aware we have a new senator in Syracuse, John Mannion, who is chair of the committee, a new committee on developmental disabilities. And I have another wonderful new colleague from Rochester, Samra Brook, who is chair of the committee on mental health. There used to be one committee on mental health and developmental disabilities, and it was separated into 2, and they are both people who represent our region of the state. So both of them very accessible, and I'm sure would be happy to join a conversation like this. But I was going to mention Samra has introduced some legislation to try to prevent the disruption of mental health care due to just the workforce problems there are. There just aren't enough people to provide the work to provide mental health care. And so they have put in a bill to just streamline, standardize the requirements for licensure in these professions and to try to build that workforce. And we're trying from a lot of angles. This is a moment where we're discovering a lot of professions that we recognize we need maybe more than we used to recognize it, and we don't have enough people to do the work. So there is, you know, at a lot of different levels of policy, we have to be helping provide the supports. We did provide a lot of funding for education this year in the budget, and I hope that's going to be helpful as schools try to make sure they've got the staff that they need. But we also, as policymakers, have to be making it worth people's while, or helping people recognize that it's a while to go into these fields and to stay in them and to work here in New York State. So we have a lot of different issues cut out for us. I'm always happy to work with people who identify a problem and are trying to figure out if there's a policy solution. So please always keep me in mind for that. And then I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Senator May. Melissa, did you want to respond to that?
I was really excited to hear what you were saying, Senator May, about the bill, as well as some of the attention to really expanding our mental health providers. So for a mid-sized city, Syracuse actually is very under-resourced in terms of providers for children and adolescents in particular. It's actually surprisingly low. And then if you have a child with a disability, practitioners with that area of specialties are even fewer and far between. I'm going to add to that not all practitioners have made the leap and are trained to work in online or remote environments. And we don't know yet if what one does in a face-to-face context really completely maps on into the remote world. But for many of the things that others have said on the panel, we're thinking not. But I will say that the School of Ed has a Center on Experiential Pedagogy and Practice with some plans in the short term to build out some of that workforce so that practitioners might come back and do a course or two, maybe a certificate in telehealth, perhaps even teachers or other providers might want to do that, and then current students can specialize. So I just wanted to make that aware.
It's a great connection. So that's I think a really concrete thing to think about is not everything that we do in person maps onto remote and vice versa. And so really thinking about making sure that we're being strategic, but also really getting the training we need to do it well. I think that's the other, those of us who had to switch to teaching remotely really quickly knew that there were challenges there. Sam, and then we're going to open it up for the community discussion.
So 2 quick comments. One, Melissa, I think you might be my new favorite person, because you've mentioned some of those pressing issues that families have been advocating about with respect to mental health services for people with disabilities. Yes, we are well aware that there's a shortage of trained practitioners. There's also the issue of the practitioners that we do have don't always have the right resources to serve people with developmental disabilities. So thank you for mentioning that. And Senator May, thank you and your colleagues for all the funding that we got for education. One thing that families are hoping for is that this budget deal is made legally binding so that no one can change their mind later and say, oh, no, never mind, we're not actually going to give you that money. So please, we need that. We need the promises to provide that funding over the next 3 years. We need that to be legally binding.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, at this time, I would like to open it up for anyone else who's here on our call that would like to either pose a question. You could either pose it through chat, or you can unmute yourself and share your question, and anyone on the panel can respond to that. So there's lots of things going. There have been lots of comments made in chat, but is there anyone would like to raise a question or something you'd like, a topic for us to talk about? Liza, nice to see you. Or hear you, I guess.
Yes, for those of you who don't, I was a student of Dr. Ashby's last semester. So in the chat, I was talking about the way in which disabled individuals have been requesting a lot of these accommodations for years, whether that's disabled students, disabled adults, disabled teachers, anything. And I was one of them. My question is, especially for disabled students, especially for those in secondary education, high school, middle school, for those who are really getting close to needing these accommodations, not just in the school, but the way in which they affect their life going forward, how do you think that we maintain some of these benefits that we have learned from a pandemic while we do discard the struggles and challenges and all these things that we don't want from the pandemic?
Great question. Anybody on the panel want to take this? So how do we ensure that these accommodations and supports continue when we don't have to be remote anymore? Monique, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's kind of like you can't unknow once you know. And so it would be incredibly difficult to pull back where we've seen successes, where we've discovered that, oh, we actually can provide students with laptops. Oh, we actually can do this. We actually can do that. It's impossible to go to turn away and go back. I know necessity is the mother of invention. Well, I've learned that desperation is the mother of acquisition. And so because of these desperate times that we've had, we've been able to acquire that which we've needed, not just for students, but also for the adults. And so, and families. And so you can't unknow. So we are now going to be held accountable for that which we have learned.
I think that's a great, we once we know more, we do better, right? That's the idea. And you're right, we can't go back. We've figured this out now. So what do we take forward? Adrian, what do you think? How do we keep it going?
Well, and I would like to kind of continue that chain of thought. And I'm speaking here as a parent of a child with a disability. It's once you know it can be provided, you can advocate for it. And that's, as parents, we have a huge role as advocates for our children. And it's just another way of learning, okay, these resources are out there. How do I get them? How do I advocate? Where do I need to go? So again, this year, it's been a wonderful learning experience as a parent to know all of these different resources that are there and try and think about how we can continue to use them and access them moving forward.
That's a great comment. I think about coming back to that CSE discussion, asking parents, how best would you like to participate in this meeting? What would support you to be able to participate in this meeting most effectively? And really being proactive, because now we know those resources are out there and that's part of our job to do that. Any other thoughts on that question, or do we have another question or comment? Sam.
And I was going to say, to piggyback off of Adrian's comment, yes, when parents know what they can ask for, they ask for it. So one of the important things, at least for myself as an advocate, is telling other parents and other students who are in a position to advocate for themselves what they can ask for. Because something that I found time and time again is that people don't know what resources are available to them, and they don't know what to ask for, and they don't know who to ask. So going forward, one of the important things is letting families and students know what they can ask for and letting them know who they can ask it of. And also letting them know what are the accountability structures in place to make sure that they get the resources that they ask for.
Those are great. I think that piece of accountability is really important, right? It's not enough to ask. We need to figure out how do we close those circles and those loops so that if things are not being addressed, folks know how to get sort of remedy for that. Melissa.
I think in addition, higher education, in particular, professional education, has a responsibility to work in tandem with the constituencies that were just identified. And so I am hoping to see teacher and leader education, counselor education, psychology education, PT and OT education, that accreditation agencies of those future professionals, school professionals in particular, build in some of the very things that we're talking about into the required preparation of students, because that, when we're talking about structural change, I worry about how much burden it puts on families, right? And sometimes even providers for doing advocacy. I completely understand is really important, and I'm not diminishing that at all, but I also think that we need some larger structural change, and we can put pressure on accreditation and make our voice heard in that area. That should be standard part of the curriculum for training of providers and professional development and licensure, etc.
Absolutely. We can think about how do we make sure that we start attending to this. And frankly, coming back to Sam's comment about kind of accountability, we attend the things we know we are held accountable to. So thinking about how do we build systems that are being driven by vision, but that then have systems in place to make sure we're staying and true to that. There's some great comments in the chat also about thinking about how mental health and disability get thought about in different cultural contexts, in particular in Native and Indigenous communities. Also, and other, if we think about other BIPOC communities, thinking about there is still stigma around mental health and stigma around disability. So how do we think about ensuring that we continue to think about, talk about, and address these things in culturally responsive and sustaining ways that we continue to keep culture centered as well? Sam, you wanted to comment on that?
Yes, I was hoping you would pull out that comment from the chat.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I have found that's incredibly effective is that for those of us who experience disability and who experience mental health challenges is to speak about it out loud. And that does a couple things. One, it lets other people know that it's okay to talk about these things out loud. Two, it identifies you as a safe person for the other people in the room who are also experiencing a disability or a mental health challenge. Every single time when I mention either disability or a mental health challenge, there's always someone who comes up to me afterwards and says, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. That's exactly what I'm experiencing. So it's important for those of us who are in the know, those of us who are comfortable with it, to speak in a public setting, to speak in our spheres of influence about these things, to signal to others that there is no shame attached with this. There's nothing wrong with us morally for having a disability or having to deal with a mental health challenge, and to create that safe environment where people learn by us modeling for them how to talk about disability and how to talk about mental health challenges. And this works wherever you are in your own cultural setting. You can be that person who begins to push back against the stigma by showing people, look, I'm here and it's okay.
You're singing my tune at the moment. So obviously we talk a lot about the importance of making diversity visible, including disability and mental health, that as opposed to trying to minimize the appearance of difference, that we actually ought to be recognizing that all of us move through the world in different ways. We all have different needs. And that if we focus on the needs that people have and think about how do we support those needs, but having this be things that people can talk about, as opposed to ways that disability or difference are sort of kept under the radar, that doesn't serve anyone very well. As I said, the pandemic, as we've all pointed out, the pandemic brought to life inequities that already existed. So let's address them. Let's deal with them. Let's look at inequitable access to resources and supports and services. Other comments or questions for our panelists? We've got a few more minutes left in our time here today. Liza, you have another question? Go ahead.
Only if no one else has anything. If other people have questions, I want to, let them talk. But we were talking about how anyone who knows me knows, but and Sam knows, but we were talking about how when we return in September, we don't want to go to this hardcore focus on academics. We don't want to do that because we would be neglecting other aspects that were, for one thing, neglected before, but are especially neglected now. This only compounds things. And before, we've seen studies saying things that, especially in the earlier grades, there is too much of a focus on academics. So even then, that was the case. But now it's even more the case. How do we ensure going in the new semester, whether from a legal perspective, a policy perspective for people like Nadizia or Senator May, or a teaching more internal perspective for those of you who are, mental health providers, teachers, that sort of thing. How exactly do we ensure that focus that we've needed so much in the past, but need even more now, on lack of focus rather, on extreme focus on academics remains.
Yeah, and there were several comments in the chat actually about that. For example, Beth Myers raised the great point that when it needed to happen, suddenly, magically, standardized testing could end, right? When we realized it had to, that we couldn't figure out, it was gone for a year. So what do we learn from that? So anyone want to comment on sort of how do we strike this balance between academics, which are vitally important? We want our children to learn and be prepared, with other sorts of needs as we go forward. Anyone want to comment on that? Amy and then Sam.
I think this is hard, right? You know, I think teachers need permission to be able to focus on social emotional learning, and they need support of their administrators. They need support of the local and federal government, right? So because there are these expectations that are placed on teachers, and if that conversation does not happen, it would be difficult, I think. So teachers need permission, they need support, they need resources to make sure that they can help support social emotional learning. And then I think advocates, families, and students need to have their voices heard and ask for support. And if, you know, if people are asking as a group, it is more likely to continue. And I think we have to continue to make that request or that known, and it has to happen often. And it has to happen and has to come from as many people as possible, because it's important, and it is hard. It's a hard shift. So we have to work together.
That idea of giving teachers permission to do what they think is right is a really important piece. Sam and then Mark.
Well, Amy kind of stole my thunder, because those are exactly the things I was going to mention. Yes, we need to give teachers the permission to do the things that they know that their students need. For the most part, teachers know that their students are struggling emotionally and with the mental health, because the teachers have also been struggling emotionally and with their mental health. So one, giving the teachers the resources that they need to address their own stress and their own social emotional needs is important, because that puts them in a place to be able to better do that for their students. So we do need to create those structural changes that allow teachers to do that. That allows all of the building staff to be able to do that. Because as a parent, I need to know that everyone who walks into the door of a school building, who might even interact with my children, is in an environment where they feel safe, is in an environment where they feel supported. They know that their leaders are pushing for them and have their back, and that their leaders will do everything to provide them with the resources that they need. So that's one. We need to create that structure, those structural changes that allow for people to do well at their jobs. The other thing I was going to mention is, again, for those of us who are kind of outside the school buildings, pushing for those structural changes, and not just parents, not just families. We need everyone. We need to be pushing people at the local level, county level, state level, federal level, to give people the space to do what needs to be done for students, to give the teachers in the classroom, these frontline workers, give them the flexibility to be able to turn on a dime to meet their students' needs.
Thanks, Sam. Those are great points. Mark and then Beth.
Just to piggyback on both what Amy and Samantha said, so many of our educators, especially our young educators are so under pressure to perform and get the numbers up. If you don't get your numbers up, you're not going to get tenure. If you don't get your numbers up, you're not going to be considered highly effective or effective. We have to shift that paradigm. We have to look at, sometimes success isn't always in the numbers. Success is when your students feel comfortable in what they're learning, not just the grade that they're achieving or the report card or how one person thinks you're dealing with your class by stopping by for 10 minutes and seeing just that little section of life in a classroom. So it's right now, I have so many of my fellow educators that are so stressed out and worried that if their levels aren't up, if their numbers aren't up, they might not be around next year. And that's why it's hard to get quality teachers in our district right now and just across the country. There is an educator shortage because of this and because of the pressures that they are put under. So not only now do they have the anxiety and pressure of the whole COVID and pandemic situation, they have their career and everything that they have to worry about also. And so that gives less focus on the social, emotional part of the classroom, because nowhere in any of the evaluations does it say you did great with the social or your emotional level of your children. It's, oh, your math grades went up this far, this went up this far, and now you're doing a fantastic job. It's really important that, I'm not saying we don't hold our educators accountable, but we have to look at it in a different way than we are right now.
Thanks, Mark. That is really important. Beth, and then Rich.
Yeah, Mark, I totally agree. That is really important. It's about embedding and valuing this as the real work of learning in schools. And we don't do that. We do not do a good job of that at all. It's what we teach our pre-service teachers in the classes that I teach and the classes that Christy teaches, when we're teaching our students how to go out in the world and be teachers. And but sometimes it's not what I see in my kids' own classrooms, right? They have like SEL class with a specialist. And although I appreciate that, and I value that they have this 30-minute session with this person who might be an expert, but it's not their teacher, right? It's not this person who they have this like really good relationship with, who really understands them and knows who they are. And it's really, the teachers don't have this opportunity, because the teachers are seen as like, I'm here to teach content. And we're not giving the teachers this time or this power to value the social emotional learning as the real work of teaching. Like, this is the real work of teaching. It's not something we do in the margins of the classroom. It is actually the real work of teaching and learning in classrooms. And we don't value that enough. We don't value that in sometimes in teacher preparation. I think we try to, right? But also in leadership in schools, in legislation, in lots of ways. And I think we really need to shift that.
Such an important point. Rich, last question or comment.
Good evening, everyone. Boy, what a nice lead into what I'm about to say. So I'm in Maryland, and we have a lot of students per school counselor. We have some schools where it's 800 to 1 is the ratio of school counselor or school psychologist. 600 to 1 is not that unusual. This is where parents really become an important part of this process. We have to use our voices now because we have a platform that allows us to attend those school board meetings or to go to legislative session and to make friends and allies with people like Senator May in your state. And I have lots of folks here in Maryland that I work with who are really angels of advocacy, who you can go to. And that's really where the change happens, is the legislation, the law. If you can't beat them at the IEP meeting table, I'll change the law so that I can make sure equality is part of the equation moving forward. So parents, please get involved.
Thanks so much, Rich. That actually brings us to the end of our time together. I just want to thank all of our panelists so much for your being generous with your time and your experience and your willingness to share from the heart as well as from the mind. And I also want to thank all of you who were here in the audience today being part of this and bringing your comments and discussion forward. And thanks in particular to Nadija and Senator Rachel May and their office for partnering with us in this event, and the school district and Joanna and all the various elements we have here in our community. This is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. We hope to do more events like this going forward. You will also be getting a follow-up email from us with all of these amazing resources that have been dropped in the chat, and we'll keep you informed of future conversations. I want to thank everyone for your time tonight, and I wish you all the best as we move into this next phase of what we all have in store for us as a community, and hopefully we do that together. Thanks, everyone. Rachel, would you like to say anything before we go, Senator May?
I was about to type it in the chat, but just to say, I feel really good about our community being in such good hands, and not just our community, but our wider community all the way to Maryland and whatever farther points are represented here. So thank you all, and let's keep this conversation going.
Thank you so much, Senator May, and thank you all very much for being here. Have a wonderful evening.